good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us today for the third part of our webinar series, where we'll be focusing on Roman history. Much like our last session, it is quite ambitious what we are going to try and achieve this afternoon, but I hope that this is useful to those of you that might be considering offering ancient history, those of you that might be new to ancient history, and perhaps those of you that are here out of general interest. I have an expert panel with me again this afternoon. Obviously, I have Steve, who many of you know is very involved with the Historical Association. I have Tara Atkinson, who is Head of Faculty and Head of Classics at Noah Hill High School and is an expert GCSE Ancient History teacher. And I have Anthony Smart, who is a lecturer in Ancient and Medieval History at York St John University. So please do, as you can see, we're all on Twitter, please do follow us or tweet along as you are watching this. There will be, much like in previous sessions, there will be opportunity to take questions throughout. So please do use the chat function and we will try to get to those as soon as we can. In today's session, we've essentially broken it down into three parts. The first part will think about the foundations of Rome, really, and sort of the myths that surrounds the history of the early part of Rome's empire, or even before the empire, as we sort of move into the Republic. We're then the second part will focus on our enemies of Rome, and we'll focus on two key figures that you all have heard of, Hannibal and Cleopatra. And then we are going to be coming back to Roman Britain, and we'll have a think about how the Romans interacted with us here. So I am going to pass straight over to Anthony now to get us going on today's session.
Thank you, Gráinne. So as Gráinne said, I'm a specialist in Roman and medieval history, particularly the political culture of the late Republic and the early Empire. So I'll do my very best now to share the screen, which I've just practiced, so that should work. Let's see. There we go. So as Gráinne said, we're going to be focusing on a few different areas today. And what I wanted to begin with is a speech that emerges from the long annals of Roman history. And it's one that I think kind of encourages us to recognize the different characteristics of Rome, the different ways we can interpret the empire that it becomes, but also expose the kind of crucial issues that lie at the heart of the Roman imperial experiment. So this is an extract from a wider speech that is emerging on the eve of battle. This is one last gasp of freedom, one effort by the Caledonian forces to deprive Rome of ultimate victory. The words that jump off this slide are ones that speak of freedom, and a freedom that is absolute and challenged by the Roman idea of empire. And the speaker is an obscure character we know simply as Calgacus. The image we have is of him speaking on the eve of battle, trying to get himself heard, surrounded by thousands upon thousands of brave, valiant warriors of the north. And when he can eventually speak, he delivers this searing indictment of Roman imperialism, and one that exposes them as obsessed with money and greed and arrogance. And it gives us the famous line, they make it a wasteland and they call it peace. And the reason I wanted to begin with that today is because it invites us to recognize what Rome can be and what Rome so often was. When we look at this, what we're drawn to is this almost barbarian idea of freedom opposed to the power of the empire. But of course, this is not coming from a barbarian source. This is not coming from a famous Caledonian poet or anything like that. It is coming from a Roman writer, perhaps the greatest of all Rome's historians, who is writing a very specific work in eulogy of his father-in-law. So what we see here is a Roman writer who is aware, self-aware of the issues that Rome can draw upon and can create. And so what it really presents, and this is what I always like to begin with, is this notion of slavery or freedom. When you think of Rome, you often think of the famous characters, and we'll be dealing with those later today. But what you also get a sense of is this dichotomy, this fixed dichotomy between slavery, those that they conquer and are dragged into the Roman world, and the illusion of a freedom that Rome also seeks to offer. The battle is a momentous occasion where the Romans undoubtedly are vastly outnumbered. But you don't need me to tell you that, of course, the battle does not go the way of Calgacus. But I want us to begin with this idea coming from Roman Britain, because what it really encourages us to recognize is the kind of core tenets of Roman imperialism, the factors that lead to the rise of Rome, but also crucially, the way that Romans themselves seek to identify. This is not a Caledonian source. This is something that is quintessentially Roman from Rome's greatest historian, and yet it is willing to expose the darkness that lies within the imperial project. And when we talk of the Roman Empire, it is this we so often consider: the might of Rome, the sheer majesty and grandeur, and the momentous kind of scale of the Roman Empire. If we think about this and we imagine that this same area now is covered by at least 40 modern nation states, at one stage, all of these lands bowed their head to the rule of the Caesars. They bowed their head under a small number of individuals that seemed to both belong into the kind of Roman concept of divinity as well as the mortal realm. And what Tara and I are going to try and do as best we can is to navigate this world for you, to think about the way in which, and Tara's going to jump in a second, the way in which we think of the narratives of Rome. So we begin with this image: Roman ambition, Roman arrogance, Roman greed, set against an image of barbarian freedom and a last gasp effort to defy the Roman Empire. And then we'll pick up with that when we get back to Britain a little bit later. So that's how I wanted to start today. So Tara, over to you.
There we go. Right, picking it up exactly where we got to last time, hopefully. There we go. What we wanted to look at initially was a misconception, really, or not a misconception, but a common conception of Rome as a gigantic empire, as Anthony's just talked about. But when you encounter the GCSE in ancient history, some of you may be thinking about doing, we go right back to the very beginnings of the Roman imperial experiment, Rome's aggressive expansion over a series of centuries. And as you can see from the map on the presentation, Rome originally was this little tiny village and became a city-state amongst many others in the peninsula of Italy. So originally, Rome is very different from what our minds tell us it was like. It wasn't this sort of pristine marble metropolis. It was really a sort of little tiny village on a river, on some hills. And students find that quite a big mental shift, thinking about the Romans initially as sort of village people, and them then becoming what they thought they were. So that's something we have to tackle as ancient history teachers. This is very much the locality of Rome, and when we read about the early history of Rome and we hear about these grand campaigns and their wars against their neighbours, I mean, it's all happening within about a day's walk. So we're thinking more like cattle raids, really, or skirmishes rather than full-on battles. But the historians of this early period of Roman history, and if we go back a couple of slides, you can see we're really talking about the 8th century BC, the traditional date of the founding of Rome, and before and even after that. We're talking really about a very small area. The rest of Italy is not Roman at this point, and that blows kids' minds. You know, oh, hang on, Italy's Roman. No, no, no. Right at the very beginning, it's this tiny little city-state. So we have to tackle the Romans' conception of their own history, which does not present them as a tiny, unimportant village people. It presents them from the very beginning as highly advanced, aggressive, successful, sophisticated people. And that brings us on to the second theme of our presentation today, really, which is how you cope with myth versus history, which is probably very different to anything that they'll encounter in modern history. So there we go, we're in Latium, we've got Rome, there she is, right in the middle there, on the Tiber River, one of many city-states. And it looks something like this. Very, very unexciting, looks quite what you might think of as classical, but when we start looking at this with students, we have to start with the archaeology because there really isn't anything else reliable. And we start to look at something like this artifact here, which is a funerary urn, possibly in the shape of a house of this sort of period. And we can see it's very simple. It's got a sort of curtainy door type thing. We're not talking underfloor heating. We're not talking mosaics. We're not talking wall paintings. We're not talking triclinia with lovely cushions to rest one's elbow on. We're talking about very simple living. And all the history that they study takes place in these conditions, at least to begin with. And we come back to the question, do we call it history? Well, that's our question. So the stories of early Rome are really they're mythical, they're very famous myths, and they're told to us by the historians of the 1st century BC, who are living in a very particular political and social context of upheaval, of change, of the coming of the emperors, of Augustus, the end of the Republic, which is quite a complex period, and one which our students don't really have time to grasp in any great detail. What they do understand are myths. They understand the stories of heroes and quest stories, and that's really where Rome begins. So the historian Livy gives us in great detail the story of the Trojan hero Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, written by Virgil in the same sort of period, who brings everything, the survivors. He's a refugee, fantastically relatable. He's a refugee from Troy in what's now Turkey, and brings all the survivors to eventually, after many different adventures, to Italy, and was considered by the Romans to be the founder of their people. And Aeneas is a really interesting figure if we're trying to get our heads around who the Romans are, and what they think of themselves as being. He's an absolutely core figure, someone who is respectful of the gods because, well, partly because one's his mum. So he's the son of the goddess Venus, the goddess of love. And he's fulfilling a God-given quest to go and settle the Trojans somewhere else. And he pushes through that, even when he has to leave his girlfriend. He goes and does these things. So the Romans really saw him as a core hero, as someone who displays pietas, this dutifulness to the gods, to his nation, and then to his family as well. And on the coin you can see here, minted by his alleged descendant, Gaius Julius Caesar, in the 1st century BC, he's carrying his father on his shoulder. And for the Romans, that represents a really core value of you look after your parents, you look after your family, but you also obey the gods and you do whatever you can to support your nation. And he then leads us to the most famous Roman myth of all, that of Romulus and Remus, which is a myth. And something we have to really examine with students is that this probably isn't a Roman myth even to begin with. It's probably an import. This idea of boys suckling on a wolf, which, trust me, has them rolling in the aisles. That picture really freaks them out. But it's such a commonplace myth that you can do a lot of cross-cultural discussion with that one. It's really interesting, actually, to say, okay, do you recognise the story of Moses in the basket? An abandoned child who's rescued by good fortune. If it depends on what order you're studying your units in, because we do Persia first. So that's the other period study. And in the Persian Empire unit, we study the childhood of Cyrus the Great, who again is, in one version of his story, he's brought up by a shepherd, he's a lost prince, he eventually regains his kingdom, just as these Roman twins, Romulus and Remus, do. So it's a really tricky one to talk about myth versus history in Foundations of Rome, because it's so tempting to say, oh, it's a myth, don't worry about that. But what we're really studying, and I think students grasp actually very well, is that we're looking at the Romans' sense of identity and that they are survivors, like Romulus and Remus. And of course, many of you will know that when these boys grow up, Romulus kills Remus in a dispute over a wall. I mean, it's like their next door neighbours. And that's again about pietas. It's about the development of one's nation over one's family. And so, although it's mythology, it's such a good way to access the Roman psyche and to think about imperialism as a kind of core value, even within themselves. So that's where we begin, really, with myths. And we do talk about whether they're true or not. And, that provokes some interesting discussions about what history is and what the ancients considered history to be, and how that's quite a different concept from our view of what history should be. And it continues in that vein, really. So our first little look at Rome, we have a monarchy. So Romulus is the first king of Rome. He has a bit of a recruitment problem. He has an immigration problem in the opposite sense. He hasn't got enough people. So what he does, and this is a really good example of, I suppose, ancient history teaching at its most somehow tricky and also deepest. He goes off and has his men kidnap some women from a nearby people called the Sabines. So they invite the families over for a festival, as you do, and they kidnap the women and they force marry them to Roman young men. So immediately, it depends on whether you're doing this first, but within seconds really of starting looking at early Roman history, we have a story of kidnap, rape, and forced marriage. Now, that's something that is a real opportunity in a classroom to have a very mature conversation with students about, and they cope with it really, really well. But it's also something about the Roman psyche. How can you have foundation myths that celebrate brother killing brother with Romulus and Remus, and then the rape and acquisition of women by force, and how do we cope with that? And again, it's very illustrative of the aggressive nature of early Roman history. We take what we want. So Romulus and the women, they sort of settle down eventually. Livy presents it as a very happy story. So many problems with that. This is Romulus's wife Hersilia in the middle of the scene, separating her new husband on the right with his wolf shield, and her father, Titus Tatius, who stands behind her. And again, this is a really interesting episode because Romulus ends up sharing the throne with this guy, Titus Tatius, his father-in-law. So because this is written by a historian from the 1st century BC, we're starting to see the drip-feedy history of Roman politics. Because by the time Livy's writing, Titus Livius, 1st century BC, the Romans have 2 consuls, so 2 heads of state, every year. The sharing of power is an absolutely intrinsic part of the Roman Republican government. And it's even possible for him to then say, oh, well, the beginnings of that are right at the very beginning of the Roman monarchy, not just the Republic, but we have Romulus the king sharing power with Titus Tatius. We are able to compromise. We are able to accommodate incomers. And for the Romans, people coming in to the city and becoming citizens is an absolutely ancient concept. So Romulus rapes and seizes the Sabine women, but he also sets up Rome as an asylum for refugees from elsewhere, for criminals, for people who've managed to free themselves from enslavement. They all become part of this initial state. And that's, again, a really interesting foundation story and quite different to probably what you would see elsewhere, which makes the Romans very different in their character. So the kings take off. Romulus and Titus Tatius, they're the first of 7. The second king is very different in tone. It feels like the Romans have had enough of war for the time being. And so they elect, again, a foreigner, actually, another Sabine called Numa Pompilius. This is a coin, again, of the 1st century BC. So we're talking perhaps 700 years after when the events are set. This coin has got a picture of Numa, as the Romans of the time thought of him, with the beard. Proper ancient Romans have beards. They're very keen on that, because in the 1st century BC, Romans don't have beards. I think we could probably have done this seminar, actually, as Romans have beards, Romans don't have beards, Romans have beards again. So when we pick up with Roman Britain again, they've got beards again, or nearly. But this one is an old ancient Roman king. He's got his name on his headband. Very, very exciting, cool. He's called Numa. And he was a completely religious king. He reinvents the calendar, for example, to have 12 months, sets all the festivals up, makes sure everybody's worshipping people at the correct time. He creates a temple to show whether Romans are at war or at peace. And during his reign, they're always at peace. And this is where we hit a problem with the Roman historians of this period, because it's all very 2D. It's very good guy, bad guy, warlike guy, peaceful guy. And it feels like we're just getting types of kings in this phase of history. The third king is back to war again. So we've gone from war and religion to war again, and he's called Tullus Hostilius. Now he starts Rome's expansion big time because he goes back and conquers the city where Romulus and Remus came from, which is called Alba Longa, and he does that by an interesting means. The Romans and the Albans are at war, and they come up with a plan to save as many lives as possible by nominating 3 soldiers from each of the cities who happen to be triplets. This is just amazing, isn't it? The Romans have got a set of triplets. They're called the Horatii. The Albans have got a set of triplets called the Curatii, and they're going to fight. And whoever wins that battle wins the war and gets to take over the other city. So it could have been quite close for the Romans. We could have been going, no, the Empire of Alba Longa at this point, despite the fact it's probably a fictional city. The Romans win this. And again, it's quite an interesting illustration of how they conceptualize their history, that they almost won by good luck. Livy's story is a wonderful little exercise in dramatic tension, because it's down to the last brother, a very last brother. And Livy says, I've seen their burial mounds. I know that this happened. So that's, for once, a bit of a sense of what's true and what's not true from him, which is nice to discuss with students. So the Battle of the Triplets, and then Rome starts to expand, and that sort of starts our imperialist history, really, where they conquer their neighbours, the Alba Longans. And we continue. So what evidence is there that the kings really existed? We are going to talk about later on how the kings move into, well, they get thrown out and a republic comes in. But there's very little evidence for them. Archaeology is pretty sparse. This is called the lapis niger, the black stone found in the Forum. And really, it's got very archaic Latin with one word for kings on it. And that's it. It doesn't tell us anything more than that. So again, a bit frustrating, but also means that we end up relying on Livy's mythologized history rather than archaeology, and discussing different types of evidence with students. Although, if you were teaching this, you wouldn't have to think about accuracy in quite the same way as you would, say, with Hannibal or with Cleopatra or with Alexander. It does provoke some interesting discussions about how much can we know about this archaic period in Roman history. So then we get, after 7 kings, various different stories, lots of different characters there. We finally get to the end of the series with the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, who's quite often called Tarquin the Proud. My kids like to make lots of jokes about how the Romans drove him out of Rome on a superbus, but that's very lame. Superbus means arrogant or proud. Apparently he was called this behind his back. He makes the lower classes, the plebeians, work on his building projects and fight in his wars. They're not happy. He kills and exiles the upper classes to get their property off them, and because they don't agree with him, they're not happy. So this all sets the scene for a dramatic episode in Livy, which again, it is quite a sensitive one to discuss with students. And the story is about the very famous Lucretia, who, where do we start with this? The son of the king, Sextus Tarquinius, he takes a fancy to a virtuous woman. And honestly, Livy makes it out to say that he's attracted to her because she is super virtuous. She weaves, she looks after her husband's guests. She's the perfect aristocratic wife. She's just great. And he's really sort of turned on by that. Yeah. And that's how Livy presents it. So while he's out with some other young aristocratic men besieging another city, one night Sextus goes back to the house of Lucretia, and she's a member of the royal family. She's married into the royal family, and he threatens her, and he says, if you won't sleep with me, I will kill a slave, I'll put the slave next to you, and we'll make it look like you had an affair with him instead. How's that? So she gives in to him. Livy tells the story. It's an interesting one to do with students. All right, they do understand how problematic that narrative is. They understand how Livy is a male Roman historian of the 1st century BC. And so everything she does is, as a character, is put into her mouth by him. We do discuss how much agency this character has, and it's an interesting one. You know, we do sometimes get onto interesting cultural topics like honor killings, that sort of thing, because she chooses then to call her husband. He comes along with his friends, including a chap called Lucius Brutus, and she tells them what's happened, and then she kills herself. Now, that is a decision which, of course, has to be discussed with students quite sensitively, but it's a decision that Romans saw as absolutely critical in teaching Romans how to behave, and particularly Roman women. Because in Livy, as Lucretia prepares to stab herself to death, she says, let this be so that how to put it, Roman women know how to behave in the future, that there can never be any excuse for unchaste behaviour, any excuse at all. Wow. So she dies, and then up stands Lucius Brutus, who again is a member of the royal family, and he swears that he will avenge her death, and makes all the others with him swear that. He goes out to the people and swears that, and that's what kicks off the end of the monarchy in Rome, this defence and vengeance for Lucretia's death. And I think at that point, Anthony, you're picking up from there, aren't you? There we go.
Thank you. Bear with me, everyone.
Just while Anthony's getting his PowerPoint set up, please do feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat as we go through. And we will shortly be coming to an opportunity where we can take some questions.
So as Tara's been saying so very well, this is a crucial moment, and it becomes one of those foundation myths, those kind of that grey area between myth and history. And what we've seen so far then, in reality, is the way in which that Rome is seeking to create its own identity. So you've heard Tara run through all these different notions that the Romans would characterize as virtues that they themselves would admire. And as Tara, again, has explained so very well, these are really delicate topics to talk about with students. And it's the same for me at university level as well. When we approach these ideas and these moments of Roman history, we need to place them very firmly in their context, which is, of course, Roman, but 1st century BC, which carries with it certain connotations. But throughout all of this, what the Romans are seeking to do is give themselves a story, and give themselves a story that sets them apart from everyone else. Every other city-state around them, every other power, every other empire that they would later meet, this complex narrative, this artificial fabric they're weaving together gives them a sense of identity no one can really compare to. And what it also allows them to do is expand and give an explanation for that. So what we notice here in this terrible defining moment is Rome seeking to remove itself from monarchy. And that becomes a crucial defining characteristic of the Republic. And one of the weirdest things perhaps is that it also becomes a crucial defining characteristic of the early Principate under Augustus and his immediate successors. And the focus then shifts on the idea of a Republican identity. And it will come as no surprise to all of you that actually what we have here really clearly is an artificial sense of history. So what the Romans do is they take a really messy part of their past about which they have some vague ideas, but not a real clear image, and they clarify it, and they clarify in a very distinctive way. So for the Romans, there is the time before and there is the time after. And the Republic that emerges immediately after the fall of the monarchy is pristine. It is beautiful. It is that kind of traditional marble-esque image we might have in our minds when we focus on Rome. So what they're creating is the ideal Republic that never at any stage existed. The Republic was always broken. It could never truly be fixed. And the fact that it fell as it did in the 1st century BC is almost remarkable. You know, we would have expected it to fall far sooner, perhaps at the end of the 2nd century BC. But the image they present is artificial. And as Tara has highlighted, when we look at these kings of Rome, they are almost caricatures. You know, they seem to embody a certain type, a certain virtue, a certain weakness, a certain issue. And the entirety of that, I think, as much as I can understand it, is to do with creating that sense of identity, but also controlling their history. And it gives purpose and meaning then to the emergence of the Republic. So what the Romans do, and this is a satirical image, obviously much later, that is designed to epitomize that, is they take the notion of the monarchy as everything that is bad, about individual rule, the idea on the fear of tyranny, the idea of someone who can speak well but control people and force them to work against their best interests, and they create it as something that is highly polluted. And all through kind of the Roman world, there is a fear of pollution. You know, this is something that is tangible to them. So if someone dies in the Roman family, they will be shown respect, but every kind of action that takes place after that is to mitigate the pollution, to mitigate the kind of potential vice-ridden miasma that emanates from death. So one thing we have then is the idea that the last king is deeply polluting, that he actually erodes the core virtues of the Roman world, and he needs to be removed by force. And what we also get a sense of then is this notion of a monarch versus an aristocracy, but crucially an aristocracy that is defending the rights of the people, defending the rights of everyone around them, and willing to challenge this form of power. But it's artificial, and it feels artificial. I suspect even for contemporary Romans, you know, Tara's mentioned Livy, who are reading or hearing Livy, they would know that something perhaps might be amiss here. They might recognize things that seem a little bit ahistorical. So it's presented as this great act of liberation. And what we then have the emergence of, as though overnight, is this wonderful elected government that seems to contain every possible check and balance, every way that to limit anyone to become a monarch, to become a king in the future. So we go from tyranny to a balance of powers. But again, this feels fake, and it should do. It's the Romans recreating their past. But what I find most remarkable, and I've touched on in some of my writing, is that actually, although the kings do disappear, as in the position of the king, their powers remain, and their powers are kind of hoovered up by elements of the early republic, and they're still there even when Augustus is proclaiming himself as somehow the first amongst many, and in reality the first of Rome's emperors. So there is a shadow here, which I think is remarkable, and certainly my students are drawn to this idea of a king no more, but actually the republican system itself is built into the memory of the king. So you look at the clothing, for instance, that the senators take to wearing. You look at the language that is sometimes used to describe these individual components of the cursus honorum, of the ladder of officers, of the republican system of government. And what you find is the shadow of the king, the power of the king, which is crucial. And even an obscure title, for instance, the inter rex or something like that, when there's been often some kind of fraud in the electoral system and there's an issue and the consuls can't be fully elected, they do kind of still bow their heads to this role of king, albeit for a very, very short fixed window. So I'm always struck by the fact that actually, although the kings have disappeared, the mechanisms and the visual attire of their form of government kind of remains. It's hoovered up slightly, it's recast, and it's recast in a really highly polished manner that actually we should challenge, and I think students should be willing to challenge. And it's also during this period that we get the notion of the patres conscripti, this illusion of the Senate as this pristine, idealistic, virtuous and noble body that only has Rome's interests at heart, when we know, of course, that actually within this period, the reality of Rome is not too dissimilar from the image that Tara showed you of that kind of very small village type effect. You know, it's become a lot bigger, but it's in no way the empire that it would become. It's no way the Republican empire that it would become in the 1st century BC. So what we begin to recognize then is the emergence of Rome as a republican power, and that the republic is its greatest experiment in government, and the republic is something that must endure, must be celebrated, and must always be defended. And the image it gives us is of people's devotion to their system of government. And through that, more than anything, their devotion to fighting for Rome against Rome's many, many enemies, but also crucially serving Rome in a pious manner, to believe in the Roman gods and to recognize that the Roman gods themselves dictate the fortunes of men and women all across this world. So it's not simply that you pray to one god or any specific god, it's that you pray to certain very, very powerful gods, but that religiosity subsumes into every part of your life. What we also have the emergence of, and it's been recognized already, is this deeply patriarchal world. You know, when we talk about Roman political identity, we're talking about a very small select body of Roman men within the Roman city often. So we have that notion, and some of you will probably be familiar with these terms, the idea of the paterfamilias, patria potestas, this right of control, this very strict hierarchy focused in particular on the male line, but one that creates this very strong sense of patriarchy, which we can't fully escape until much, much later in the Roman world. What we also notice then is, again, this kind of rewriting of history. So on the one hand, in later writings, the early republic looks deeply poor, which is a factor to be celebrated, because if they're poor, they don't have this kind of ambition to become greedy. There's no kind of internal vice. They're pure people because they have no great money, not huge amount of slaves. They're fighting for their survival. So they create this idealistic pastoral sense of past that is focused on people who serve. And they're very proud of that. What we also have is the splintering of the Roman world between the patricians and the plebeians, and very gradually we enter into a period that is often called the struggle of the orders, which runs through the kind of concerns and the conflict between different elements of the Roman social world, the Roman stratified existence. But what we also notice, and this is something I think that is important, is this notion of the patron and client relationship, simply because this doesn't disappear. If we were to find ourselves in Rome at any stage, kind of from the mid-Republic onwards, what we would find is very powerful individual men who could summon wider bodies to support them. And these would be the kind of client-based, often focused on some kind of political friendship. But the reality, I think, for the early Republic is that these are kind of not quite tribal leaders, but people who can summon men to fight on their behalf, but also to pass through any kind of efforts, legal or otherwise, that they're seeking to do. And then I've noted up there on the slide this idea of the legal codification. When you think of Rome, you can think of all different things, but one thing jumps out, and it's this notion of law, where law is absolute. It's written, it's codified, and it has great weight all the way through the Roman imperial experiment. So what we're really looking at with the early republic, I think, everyone, is an image of purity, but also scarcity. They're creating an image that is designed to celebrate their past, but also to explain where they get to. And that runs all the way through everything that Tara and I will be discussing today. The crucial thing, and it won't surprise any of you when I say this as a historian, is that the reality is so very different. This is not a republic that is built for beauty at all. It's about utility, it's about endurance, and ultimately what it looks like is it's about making sure no one individual, so as Tara was highlighting, you know, the very first king, this idea of power sharing, that no one individual can assume absolute control, that no one could ever be a king again. And kingship is always a dirty word in the Roman world, politically, from this point on. If anyone has ambitions to individual power, you attack them by calling them a king. So what do we have? Well, we have 2 elected consuls, but that's not enough. You limit their power, and you limit their power in time. They have 1 year in office, which allows them to exert influence, but they can't then create this great dynasty or anything like that. It's about controlling this sense of individual power. What it also gives rise to, and this is no surprise, is an oligarchic focus. You know, that this is about the powerful individuals within this wider world. This is about the aristocracy and the maintenance then of their control over the wider Roman system, the wider Roman political order. The consuls we imagine in this world are in reality kind of militia leaders, charismatic individuals. They're encouraged, and the first consuls are encouraged to do this, take an oath to never follow, never elect, never create another king. So that's their kind of core political framework. That's their core political foundation stone, never another king. But what it also reveals is the way that Rome, throughout this world and throughout this period, is only too willing to look backwards, to create history, to engage with myth, but to look backwards for their kind of reason to be. So there's this great focus on the Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors, that actually you should follow what people have done before. You should be proud of the service that your system, your people, your government has offered you. And it's this idea of history repeating, but crucially that it was better then, and we can try and be as good as those that came before us. So we have the pristine image versus the reality, and the historian Tara was mentioning, Livy is a crucial window for this, for studying this period for us, but he is so far removed from any kind of contemporary eyewitness account. So that's what I wanted to stress, that we have the kind of myths that Tara has explored, and there are a number of others. Some include Hercules, for instance, with whom the Romans have a very strong fascination. But we have these kind of different tales, and what you notice is they're really quite violent. Some of them are deeply upsetting and unsettling for the modern audience. And the only way we can navigate that is by focusing on the actual sources themselves and recognizing how and why they're creating these mythic histories. And what I wanted to do now, and with Tara and Gronya as well, is just offer the floor up to any questions.
Yeah, do we have any questions based on that first section before we move on to thinking about some of our enemies of Rome? Please do drop any questions you have in the chat. Otherwise, we will move on and we can pick up any questions at the next break. Tara, I think I'm passing back to you now. No, going straight on with Anthony. Sorry.
I think it's me. If that's all right, Gronya.
Wrong running order in my brain.
I'll carry on.
Okay, thank you.
If I can, let's see. Famous last words. So what I want us to turn to now, and what Tara and I thought would be useful, again, partly because these will be familiar names, I think, to most, even if it's courtesy of film or Netflix or whatever else, is 2 really famous enemies of Rome. And the reason we were keen to think about this is, one, because we can see the problems here, the problems in studying Roman history, but also how you can navigate that really carefully. Crucially, also, the way in which Romans write about their enemies actually tells us so much about them, their history, and their own kind of political identity and ambitions. So the one I'm going to talk about is Hannibal, and then Tara, who has absolutely magnificent and a magnificent understanding of Cleopatra, will guide you through that very, very complex kind of individual character, but also all the different layers of Cleopatra too. what I wanted to focus on then first is Hannibal. So I suspect every single one of us has heard the name Hannibal before, and we might have an idea in our minds normally associated with war elephants and the kind of daring military escapades that Hannibal, a Carthaginian figure, a Carthaginian general, was able to undermine and to use against the Roman forces. When we look at Hannibal, what we're really recognizing is a polarized world, a world between two very influential but very different forms of power. What we're seeing is, on the one hand, Rome, and by this point in the late 3rd century BC, Rome has become not just a crucial land-based power, able to rely upon its republican armies, great legions that are becoming ever more professionalized, but also has turned or attempted to transform the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, into their own sea. And that's how Romans began from the First Punic War onwards to refer to the Great Mediterranean. What we have then is these two distinctive sets of powers. So Rome, which emerges as a new power, whereas Carthage has kind of ruled the waves for a very long time, but also a different form of political understanding. When we look at Carthage, and when we think of, and that's the kind of direction we're heading, everyone, this is the map that will kind of help us see where Rome ends up, courtesy of some of these wars and defeats of some of these enemies, is when we think about Carthage, and I've chosen here a deliberately evocative image of Carthage, what we're really looking at is a commonwealth. You know, people might sometimes talk of the Carthaginian Empire as a rival to the Roman Empire, but it's not strictly speaking true. When you look at Carthage, what you're looking at is at its core, a very expansive mercantile naval power that brings together different trade systems, different trade influences all across the Mediterranean and further still. What Carthage also offers is a weight of history, a history that is very, very different to that offered by Rome. We have a different language, a different set of gods. We have a very different culture, which is also a very different political culture as well. But what this image and the next one kind of epitomize for us is that this is a commonwealth of power of great wealth as well, that drags together different peoples, different identities, but doesn't force its own form of self, its own identity on others. So Carthage is in many ways an alien component for Romans. That it can't be treated in the same way, it can't be understood as a rival power, but it is very, very different. So it's not an empire, that's the crucial thing, in the same way. It's not about absolute control. It's not about enforcing Carthaginian identity on anyone. It's about bringing in and creating an economic fabric and an economic framework all across the Mediterranean and further still. What we have here is a people that are Phoenician in origin. So there's a very distinctive Punic dialect, the Phoenician of the original Phoenician. And it's one where quite classically, and this won't surprise any modern historians who are watching this, where we see that history, yes, of course, no great surprise, has been written by the victor. So as soon as we approach Carthage, we swim through a huge tide of anti-Carthaginian writings emanating from Rome. And some of these are particularly cruel. So you can dip into some of the Roman stuff and even some of the Greek stuff, which is rather more favorable towards Rome. And you have an image of a people that sacrifice their young to this terrible god, to maintain the victory all across the waves and to maintain their victory. But what archaeologists have shown by excavating the Punic city of Carthage is that a vast number of these kind of remains in this highly religious area are small animals. And if you ever do find anything that looks a touch human, again, these archaeologists are very keen to suggest these perhaps are natural graves of people who have died of natural causes. But the image that the Romans and their Greek supporters suggest is that these are somehow offering human sacrifice. And for the Romans, throughout their period of rule, there are notable moments where they don't follow this. If you sacrifice a human, that is somehow completely alien to them. That is one step beyond. They do it very, very occasionally, but it's a way they characterize their enemy. They characterize barbarians. And this is what we have. So the Sicilian historian Diodorus tells us about a bronze statue of Kronos, Balhaman, and he presents this image of children falling into the great fires, the mouth of this kind of statue of the god. But in reality, the reality is actually very, very different. So again, it's about how Rome characterizes its enemies and seeks perhaps to demonize them. What we also have with Carthage, and I cannot stress this enough, is a cosmopolitan form of civilization, completely different to Rome, absolutely fundamentally different. And it's that sense of difference that I think is so crucial. What is quite peculiar sometimes for my students, at least, is when we focus on the relationship between Carthage and Rome, we have a tendency to think that they kind of have been circling each other for a long time as enemies, but the reality is very different. We know, for instance, that in 351 there was a Carthaginian embassy that had been sent to Rome, I suspect, to see how great this new power was, to kind of study what their mechanisms of power were and their military strength, but it was to congratulate them on defeating the Samnite peoples. We know even earlier of a treaty between the two. It's somewhat obscure, but it looks as though there was a treaty, and if there's one, it's kind of likely that there were others that haven't survived. And Varro, writing a lot later, speaks of a vicus Africus within the city of Rome itself, which would tell us, I think, of a Carthaginian kind of quarter within the city. So there's a trade link that must exist there. They're renowned for having the greatest fleet of the ancient world, much like the Athenians before them. And their land forces rest predominantly, but not only, on vast mercenary armies that they can pay for, and they can summon from across their interests. So these are very big armies that offer, in many ways, highly successful military ambitions and engagement. When we approach then the Second Punic War, this is perhaps Carthage's finest moment, its last gamble, the moment when Carthage was still preeminent, I would argue, above Rome. The Second Punic War is very different to the first. This is overwhelmingly land-based. There is a lack of naval power, not on the Roman side, but on the Carthaginian. It's from this Second Punic War we have the emergence of Hannibal as the most daring, the greatest of all Rome's enemies, the greatest of all the generals of the ancient world, perhaps. And we also have Cannae. Now, Cannae is often described as the equivalent of the Somme, the first day of the Somme in the First World War, the kind of loss of life. And it's really difficult. And by all means, do jump in, Tara, if you have any more numbers. But when we look at ancient battles, we have numbers that are given to us, but we can never truly, fully know the reality. But what we do know is this should destroy Rome. A military disaster of this scale, where they've not simply been embarrassed by an enemy, but completely destroyed, and their entire system has been mocked, ridiculed. The heads of the senatorial elite have been cast back into the Roman camps. This has been an entire embarrassment and destruction of the Roman military system. Any other ancient state, I would argue, would think now very carefully about how to sue for peace, or how to retreat and restore their military strength, to restore their political strength, to restore their kind of society. And this is where Rome is different, because what we know in the wake of this terrible, terrible disaster is that the Romans do something which for them is sacrilegious. They make a sacrifice, a human sacrifice, and we think this is most likely in the Forum itself. They bury individuals alive. These could be slaves, they could be Carthaginians. There are different sources that hint different stories. But they do this as a way to remind the Roman people that we do not surrender, and we do not forgive, and we do not forget. And all the Romans then do, because they have this strong sense of political culture and political ambition, create another army. But they change the style of attack. They change the mechanisms of war. There's that inherent flexibility, but the most crucial thing about this is that they do not surrender or sue for peace. They take the fight back against Hannibal. Hannibal does not, I imagine, expect that at all. He imagines that Rome will send very eminent emissaries to sue for peace. He will force Rome back into a kind of land-based central Italian power. He will hoover up any outlying areas. They will fall under his protection. He thinks he's won not just this momentous battle, but the entire war. There will be no Third Punic War. There will be no further Roman Empire emerging from these ashes. He has won. But he does not understand what he is dealing with. He does not appreciate the sheer belligerence. And again, that's come through from those foundation myths that Tara was talking about so very well. This idea of belligerence above all, that they will fight and they will always fight, and they can drag together different peoples. What Hannibal expects to happen once he's defeated this vast army of Roman soldiers and citizens and senators is that all these outlying systems that pay homage to Rome will turn against their kind of master. They will turn against the Roman city, and they will turn against this imperial republic. That does not happen. It happens in a few isolated cases, but again, what is most remarkable is the sheer number of city-states that side with Rome. And there are a number of ways as my students, and I'm sure Tara's students, can run through that and think about it. But what it really tells us, I think, is that what Rome has created is something that is very different, and it's something that encourages people to join them, stay with them, and it very gradually, I think, corrupts their sense of self until they become half Romanized, and then ultimately, a little bit later on, fully part of the Roman world. So it's a crucial moment. Hannibal, quite famously, is recalled as the Romans take the theatre of war elsewhere, closer to the Carthaginian homeland. He is himself part of the Barcid clan, a very powerful element of the aristocracy, but not a kind of direct ruler of Carthage. And we have the famous battle and defeat, and we have Scipio Africanus engaging with Hannibal. But if we look at that and we just pause for a second, what we're also witnessing is the birth of another myth, yet another historical myth, but one that tells us about Rome as well as Rome's enemies. Because this, again, is how Rome is different. If they face someone that has defeated them, they don't necessarily destroy them or demonize them or subvert their sense of self. Instead, what they do is they can find, and forgive me for using this language, it's coming from the Roman stuff, it's coming from the Latin, they can create a noble barbarian. And what they do with Hannibal is they take this kind of mantra, this method, they create within him virtues that can be found in the barbarian world, but also importantly, virtues that you can find in Rome. So whenever we look at an enemy, a great enemy of Rome, what we're really seeing is this discordant mirror shining a very distinctive light upon the Roman world and how they want to be. So when they look at Hannibal, and Hannibal is the greatest enemy I think they ever really face, up until much later with Attila the Hun, what they present, and this is coming from Livy once more, is a deeply noble figure, someone entirely geared and suited towards war, but someone who also crucially identifies and draws upon their own kind of virtues, what they value in themselves as much as in the enemy. So power to command, readiness to obey. In Hannibal, they're perfectly united. Under his leadership, invariably, the soldiers fight to the best advantage, dash and confidence, reckless in courting danger, superb tactical ability. He never tires. He isn't a glutton. He lives a very sparse existence. And hopefully when you read this, everyone, what you're really thinking is, well, we've seen this before in the early Republic. We've seen this before with the early consuls. We've seen it perhaps even with the early kings, because that's what we're seeing once more, yet another building block on Rome's path to imperial power. His time for waking, like his time for sleeping, was never determined by daylight or darkness. He only stopped when his work was done. These are qualities, these are virtues, these are activities that Rome admires. Often he was seen lying in his cloak on the bare ground with the common soldiers. Again, this is a good thing. This is what the Romans should be doing. You don't become avaricious. You don't become greedy. You don't focus on vice. You become a model of virtue. And that is what is suggested here. But what we also have, and I'll pass over to Tara in a second, what we also have then with Hannibal is not just this kind of discordant mirror shining upon Rome, we're also seeing how they can celebrate an enemy that they have defeated. So once they've defeated someone and they will accept that he was the greatest general of all time, up until Scipio Africanus, who defeats him, what that allows them to do is suggest how much better they are, how much more powerful they are, and ultimately how Carthage's absolute destruction is required by the time of the Third Punic War. And I'll very happily now pass over to you, Tara.
Carthage must be destroyed. Right. Here we go. Okay. So it's a bit of a time gap now, really. So for the end of the... Hang on a minute, let me just there we go. All right, let's go back to the map we were looking at earlier. So Carthage is destroyed in 146 BC, and by that point, Rome is getting bigger and spreading eastwards. Also, what's happened previously that we haven't made any reference to are the conquests of Alexander the Great. And we need to understand that before we start looking at Cleopatra, who's our next enemy of Rome to look at. So you may well be aware of the conquest of Alexander the Great. These are taking place in the 330s BC, and they have a huge impact on the geography and the culture of the East, what the Romans term the East anyway, and they lead to the overthrow of the Persian Empire, which you, I'm sure, will have learnt a lot about in the previous seminar. So that leaves one of Alexander's generals, a guy called Ptolemaeus, the king of Egypt, and it's from him that Cleopatra is descended. So you can see a lovely image of this guy on his coin. There he is down the bottom there. And that is the image of the Ptolemies forevermore, for the next 300 years. And the family all look quite similar for a very good reason. There's a lot of incest. They like to think of themselves as godlike, and gods marry their brothers and sisters, or their nephews and nieces, and that's just how they roll. So this is what a Ptolemy looks like, and Cleopatra sometimes goes with that image as well, but we'll get to her image later on. So the Romans first come into contact with Egypt fairly early in their history. By the time Cleopatra is born in 69-ish BCE, it's 69 or 68, Rome has spread a very long way into the east. And you can see from this map that there are states that are parts of the empire that are directly ruled by Rome. Those are in red. And then we have blue states, which are what we might call client kingdoms. So we've got Rome, almost like the patriarch of a family, as Anthony talked about earlier. We've got Rome itself acting in that capacity to their neighbours. And these blue areas are very rich in their own right. They are ancient kingdoms in their own right, just as Egypt is. And these are all descender states from the Alexandrian conquests. So down we go, there's Aegyptus, the lovely relatively brand new compared to Rome's city of Alexandria, which had an enormous population. We're talking 1 million, 2 million perhaps. It's very much a state-of-the-art city in terms of architecture and technology. This is where the library was, where Diodorus, our Sicilian historian, who we saw earlier, was actually working during the reign of Cleopatra, which is super cool. And this is where you went if you wanted to be sophisticated and learn how a city should be, which might have embarrassed the Romans, but was certainly something that inspired them later on. So this is the Roman Empire as we start to get Rome stretching out her little greedy, rapacious fingers much more towards Egypt. And Egypt is an incredibly wealthy country. There's gold, there's grain, and Rome is large enough now to really need an external source of grain. Grain is imported. And Egypt is a big source of that. It's also in a very good strategic location militarily, because the Romans keep having a go at their enemies, the Parthians, who are where Persia was, and where part of Alexander's conquests were. And also they're on the trade routes between the Mediterranean and India and China via the sea. So it's an incredibly wealthy place, and the Romans are just itching to get hold of it. But Romans being very competitive, the upper classes in particular, the senators are not very keen on anybody actually going to conquer Egypt, because then they'll be much more important than everybody else, and that upsets that balance of power that we were talking about with the early republic, and now by this point what we call the late republic. It's on its way out, but at this point they are still very concerned with balance of power, balance of influence, and if you've got Egypt as your clients, you're going to overtopple everybody else. And so that's why it doesn't get conquered, ironically, for quite a while. So we might compare the Romans at this point with a lovely image of Stalin reaching out and grabbing the countries around the USSR from the 50s through to the 90s. And it's that sort of influence that the Romans exert in this period. They're quite pushy with demands for support, military support, grain from Egypt and so on. So they're the kind of neighbour you want to be very careful of. And that's the world into which Cleopatra is born in 69. And as she's growing up as a very young child, those are Ptolemies, more Ptolemies. There you go, you can see the family features, sort of. But just to break off a little bit, what we do notice here is that this family is Greek in origin. So they are descended from Ptolemy I, who is a general of Alexander the Great. They claim some sort of family connection, illegitimate, but with Alexander and Philip, his father. So this is a Greek family ruling Egypt. They speak Macedonian Greek up until Cleopatra, who learns Egyptian for the first time. And they're very much sort of like William the Conqueror, if you like. They're an imported royal family. Alexandria is a Greek city. It's very stratified. You have Macedonian Greeks, Greek Egyptians, and then Egyptians, and there's a Jewish population as well. So it's very hierarchical, and the Ptolemy, it's always a Ptolemy, sits at the top of that pile. So this is the world into which Cleopatra is born in 69 BC. Her father is Ptolemy XII, known as the flautist, the flute player, which is not a compliment, and he's the chap at the bottom on the right. So he's been king for a while, actually. He's been king since 80 BCE. He's long lived, but he's not particularly high achieving, and he has the Romans yapping at his heels, so he has a very difficult reign. So the Romans, like we say, they are after Egypt quite actively. There's a chap called Crassus, who you may be familiar with from Horrible Histories, who's the richest man at this point. He wants to annex Egypt and proposes that quite strongly. It's shot down because no one wants him to have that much influence. At that point, or very soon afterwards, Ptolemy the 12th, Cleopatra's father, gets kicked off his throne. And because the Romans are so powerful, they're so influential, the Egyptian king has to have their support. So he goes off to Rome to seek recognition of his kingship. And in order to do that, he has to suck up to three rather important guys who we tend to call the first triumvirate. They're not an official body of rulers. They are three guys who are trying to influence politics for their own ends. And at this point, we have Crassus, who's the money. We have Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey in English, who's the military star. And we have Gaius Julius Caesar, who will be consul in the year that Ptolemy arrives, and so can get things done. He becomes a bit more famous than that, but we'll get to him. So Ptolemy arrives in Rome, he gets his deal, and he eventually goes back and is put back on his throne by military force supplied by the Romans. So he's really a puppet ruler. He's a puppet ruler. So while Cleopatra's growing up, the Romans are gradually becoming this very invasive force in Egypt, to the point where we've got Roman troops garrisoning Alexandria, sort of on behalf of the king, but they're there in force. So it's like having a massive aircraft base or something. The Romans are very much visible in Alexandria. Now, Ptolemy XII is happy about this to some extent, because it means that his rivals within his own family can't kick him off the throne because he's got Roman support, but he bequeaths that relationship to his children when he dies. So he dies in 51 BC, leaving his two surviving oldest children, because he executed one of the older ones for trying to get rid of him. That's Cleopatra, who becomes Cleopatra VII, and her younger brother/husband, told you incest, who's Ptolemy XIII. So if you can keep up with your Ptolemies, you're doing well. The students tend to just call them by their number, which works. It's better than Roman numerals. They find that easier. So there we go. Here she is. Here's Cleopatra the Queen. And as you can see, she presents herself in very interesting ways. Now, as Anthony points out, history is written by the winners, and we have to try and get round that to see Cleopatra. We don't have written histories from her perspective, but we do have images, and we can do a bit of work with classes to try and at least say how she wanted to be seen. So on the left, we have two Greek-style images, one on a coin with her showing her Ptolemaic family features quite strongly, very deliberately, in order to show her legitimacy as ruler. She's also wearing a white linen headband, which we tend to call a diadem. And again, that's her equivalent of a crown, and her braided hair and her bun, that's very typical Cleopatra. Down the bottom, very similar bust of her, same sort of pose with the diadem, with the melon bun hairstyle, that's what we tend to call it. And that's her presenting herself to her Greek subjects as a Greek Macedonian ruler. The coin showing her sort of more masculine facial features to again stress her strength as opposed to her stereotypically womanly weakness, which is what they'd expect. However, on the right, we have something really exciting, which is Cleopatra being portrayed as an Egyptian queen alongside her son, who's Ptolemy XV. Yeah, there's a few to go. Otherwise known as Caesarion, and he's portrayed as a full adult pharaoh. So they're really leaning into the Egyptian style pharaonic rulership that got Cleopatra more support from the rest of Egypt, not from just from the Greekified Alexandrians. So she's really intelligent. She speaks about 9 languages. Plutarch lists them all. Doesn't include Latin. It's interesting. she presumably, given that she was such a sponge for languages and that she knew some Romans fairly well, she probably sucked up Latin pretty efficiently, but he doesn't list it because he's Greek and he doesn't care. But the languages are all of her neighbouring countries, and so she didn't need an interpreter, which of course is a very intelligent thing to do. And she's clearly academic, she's clearly intelligent, and she sees the route to greatest support, not necessarily just from Rome, but also from the peoples of Egypt who are not just Greek. So she speaks Hebrew, she speaks Egyptian, she speaks normal Greek, she speaks Macedonian Greek, she speaks Aramaic, and various other Persian as well, various other languages of the locality. So she's a very outward-looking cosmopolitan ruler, but with a brain. And here she's presenting herself as a traditional Egyptian queen. If you go back to someone like Nefertiti, 1,200 years before this, you see exactly the same styling, the exact same headdress, the exact same dress. She's really going for old-style Egyptian. So she's quite a sophisticated ruler. That's not from the Roman perspective, that's Cleopatra. So her family caused her endless problems. Here we go, Ptolemy. By this point, Cleopatra is married and ruling, allegedly, with her probably 12, 13-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. They don't get on. In fact, like with many younger siblings, she tries completely to keep him out of things. She won't let him sign official documents. She just ignores him, which, you know, if you're an older sibling, we can relate. But he doesn't like that, and as he gets older, he and his advisors try and get him more power and exile her. So between about 49 and 48, Cleopatra is kicked off her throne, she's exiled, we think she goes to Syria, she somehow raises some sort of army. But otherwise, she's out of things, and how's she going to get back on the throne? She needs an opportunity, and she needs a friend. And this is where we come back to the Romans again. But by this point, the Romans are fighting each other. This is what we call, I guess, Caesar's civil war. It doesn't really have a name. By this point, Caesar's conquered all of Gaul. So coming back to our theme of imperialism, you can see the orange area that we now call France, bits of Belgium. Caesar's been off conquering for the last 8 years. That wasn't planned. It's very piecemeal, as Roman conquest tended to be. Back home, most of the Senate is clapping and celebrating and announcing Thanksgivings. Caesar's enemies are not. And in fact, at one point, wanted to hand him over to the Germans for war crimes. It didn't happen. I've always talked to kids about how that might have happened. It wasn't going to happen. But it shows you there's a lot of hostility towards him. And by 49 BCE, we get war breaking out between Caesar's forces and those led by the Senate, or the more conservative element of the Senate, led by his old buddy, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. So the war is quite lengthy, but it does eventually bring Caesar, after the Battle of Pharsalus, where he defeats Pompey, to the shores of Egypt in 48 BC. Now, he's trying to track Pompey down. He knows Pompey's gone down there because of that relationship that Pompey has with Egypt as their patron. Unfortunately, Pompey has not been treated like a patron. He's been executed, beheaded on the shore by on the orders of Ptolemy XIII and his advisors. Now, they think this is going to make Caesar incredibly happy. They are to be surprised by his reaction, which is not to be happy, it's to weep and to be very cross with them, because Caesar had been Pompey's father-in-law at one point. They had been political allies, and to be honest, it's more about foreigners killing Romans. Foreigners are not allowed to kill Romans because, as we've said all the way through this, the Romans have a very clear idea of their distinctiveness and their superiority, and they do not put up with foreign monarchs executing their war heroes. So Caesar's attitude towards Ptolemy XIII is immediately, let's just say, not very favourable. Okay, now their first meeting is super famous. Cleopatra, remember, is outside the city. There's some correspondence between them. It's not like she suddenly turns up and Caesar goes, "Oh, who are you?" They've been exchanging letters, and he's actually invited her to come and meet him. Now, getting to him is a nightmare because he's in the palace in Alexandria, she's outside. So the famous story goes that she somehow gets snuck into the palace. This is really it from Plutarch. This is pretty much what we've got. And there's loads of plot holes in this. Plutarch is clearly sort of embroidering it a little bit. She's carried in some sort of laundry sack, not a carpet. That's Hollywood. She's carried in some sort of sack. She's carried up to him, and they have a private meeting arranging what turns out to be their political alliance. So Plutarch's quite interesting here because he also brings out her personal qualities that Caesar may have found what's the right word here? Alluring? I don't know. Too much sex in Cleopatra. All right, she's a politician. He's a politician. He needs money to continue his civil war. Her brother is not going to give it to him. Cleopatra might. Let's put it like that in those terms. So they each get something out of this relationship. They are both very sophisticated, intelligent, well-educated people who are cutthroat politicians. They get on like a house on fire. The traditional date for Caesarion's birth is 9 months later. That's what we're going to say. So eventually they win that war. Cleopatra's put back on the throne. And in due course, she goes to visit Caesar in Rome. And this is where we start to pick up on the really interesting source material. Some of it from people who actually met her. And history written by the winners, sure. But at this point, Cicero at the bottom, very prominent Roman politician, philosopher, writer, actually writes having met her personally. It's the only real source we've got like that. So he's not very positive. We'll get to him in a minute. Writing quite a few centuries later, a couple of centuries later, the historian Cassius Dio talks about how Caesar makes them friends and allies of the Roman people. So this is formalizing the relationship that Rome had had with her father, and Cleopatra is continuing. And this is really important to her because this is how she will remain independent. So Caesar's patronage, but she's not just reliant on that. She's also made sure that there's this formal treaty with the Senate as well. And that's a really sort of belt and braces approach to diplomacy. She doesn't trust the Romans really. And she knows that if Caesar is out of the way at any point, hint, she might need something else. And she's in Rome to make sure that happens. In Rome, she meets Cicero, who doesn't like her at all. He finds her very arrogant and her entourage arrogant and dismissive of him. He has no time for women, queens, or foreigners, and she ticks all three of those boxes. And he, of course, thinks he is one of the most important senators in Rome. And she's made some sort of promise to him. We don't know what that is. We speculate in class that maybe she offered to lend him a book from the library or something like that. We just don't know what it was. But at some point, she's changed her mind, and he is incredibly grumpy about it. So that's the impression of Cleopatra we tend to get from the Roman sources, is that she is arrogant, she is superior, and she doesn't treat Romans as they would want to be treated, which of course is very prejudiced and biased. And that's kind of how the Roman sources tend to go. Okay, I'm really conscious of time. I'm going to try and speed through this incredibly quickly. Granya's just nodding at me like a maniac. Great. Okay, the 30s BC are a time where Cleopatra is trying to maintain her independence. Caesar famously is assassinated back in 44 BC. However, very soon afterwards, Cleopatra meets Marcus Antonius, who is sort of the political heir to some of Caesar's political power, alongside Caesar's great nephew, adopted son, who is known to us as Octavian. He becomes the first emperor, Augustus, later on. And the very underestimated, lovely, charming Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who's a powerful senator who was Caesar's deputy. So in the 30s, Cleopatra is really just trying to make sure she gets as much out of Mark Antony as she possibly can, and she does very well with this. They end up having a personal relationship, 3 kids this time, up in the stakes. And he gives her lots of areas that the Romans considered theirs to look after. So by 34 BC, we'll come to that coin in a minute. By 34 BC, Egypt actually controls an awful lot of the Middle East, thanks to Mark Antony deciding that Cleopatra should be looking after it, while Antony attacks the Parthians and the Armenians, because that's how he's trying to push Rome's borders further east again. They're always after Parthia. So by 32, we see something really, really interesting, certainly nothing you'd have seen with Hannibal. This is Mark Antony and Cleopatra on a double-sided coin, which advertises their position and their equality, their partnership. So by this point, Antony's made quite an explicit break with Octavian, his former political ally. He's divorced Octavian's sister, and so really has decided that Cleopatra and the East are his future, which is interesting. Cleopatra is described as the Queen of Kings, much like the Norwegian song in Eurovision. And her sons who are kings, because Antony's confirmed that, say, Caesarion will be pharaoh of Egypt. Their children will rule places like Parthia. Oh, they've not conquered that yet. Whoops. Armenia. Oh, they've not conquered that yet. But some other places like the south of Turkey, Syria, which they do control. Antony is celebrating a victory, small victory against Armenia. So it's all about military conquest and about power and about partnership. And this is just at the point where Antony's eyes start to turn westward again, and start to think about dealing with Octavian. And one of the biggest parts of this unit is the battle that's to come, the war between Octavian and Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian, meanwhile, has been stirring up things back in Rome to make Antony look as bad as possible. He's a treacherous un-Roman who's gone off with an Egyptian queen, Wicked Witch of the East, and abandoned his wonderful Roman wife, who is absolutely perfect in Plutarch's biography. She is Mrs. Perfect. She looks after all of his 8 kids at various points. So the battle that results is the Battle of Actium. Now, in Augustan propaganda and poetry, this is portrayed as like the climax of a Marvel film. It's good versus evil. It's Octavian, good, patriotic, God's favoured Octavian, defeating the wicked barbarian East. And it ends, as it must, with Antony fleeing after Cleopatra as if he's become part of her person. I think it's described in one of the sources. He's completely within her control. She's completely got him under her thumb. And when she flees from the battle, so does he. So something we spend a lot of time doing is actually unpicking that mythology, because again, we're back to myths again. This is very much history written by the victors, and we try and talk with the students about how by that point, Antony had been backed into the Bay of Actium. He'd already lost, really, and this was a breakout attempt. So it's not the great big climactic battle Octavian wants it to be seen as, and this is very much seen as this during the early Principate. It's really a breakout to try and fight again another day. Unfortunately, communication goes completely wrong. Antony's navy deserts to Octavian, his army deserts to Octavian not long afterward, and we get to the spiral downwards towards their suicides about a year later. Really interesting poem. We study a lot of poetry on this battle in the ancient history unit. Horace of the Augustan period describes Cleopatra as a doomed, destructive monster. So, she was always going to lose. But he allows her a noble death. And this is where we get those qualities that the Romans admired up against those that they didn't, just as with other enemies. So she is a stereotypical woman. She lacks control. She's drunk on Italian wine. She's overconfident. But at the same time, Horace allows her this sort of masculine quality of courage when she realizes that all is lost and she chooses to die. And he finishes this particular ode with, she was not some obscure, ordinary woman. She's a worthy enemy. And that's really important. Like Hannibal, she makes the Romans look better because of the strength of the enemies they defeat. And I think the whole series of depth studies, actually, that's a very strong thread. So really quickly, promise, her death follows very quickly. Plutarch's actually very clear about the fact that we don't really know how she died. The famous scene with the snake really it's quite interesting here. He explains why that's so famous. He says Octavian thought that was super cool and had that portrayed in his triumphal procession back in Rome. And that's why we think Cleopatra died of asp bite. There's been plenty of experiments to show that really isn't feasible. It's probably poison in a hairpin out of all the options that he gives. But another good discussion to be had about accuracy of sources. So really just to finish off with Cleopatra, Augustus makes a really big deal out of this. Coins are minted saying Egypt has been captured. It reinvigorates the Roman economy to the extent that Augustus is everybody's favourite person. And he then, Cleopatra having done the same thing, portrays himself, or is portrayed, as a pharaoh in traditional style, completely Ramesses II-esque, on monuments in Egypt, and so takes up exactly from where Cleopatra left off. And I think at that point, I'm handing back over to Antony. Sorry.
That's fine. I think so, Sarah, and I'll do my very best. So I won't spend too long on the ideas of Britain in the ancient writings. I'm just going to go back to the ideas of Tacitus, and then hopefully give some time as well for everyone to ask any questions if they do have any. So I'll quickly share again. And this is the last time I'll do so. So this is how we end then. So what Tara's just done, which is, I think, remarkable, is engage with a figure as highly complex as Cleopatra, about whom there's so many different ideas and approaches and highly complex sources, but sources that students love engaging with and studying and extracting their kind of version of the truth from. All I wanted to do then to finish today's session is take it back to Britain and focus on Calgacus once more. To close it, what I want to stress is that for Romans, as foreign as Egypt could be, and its kind of deep-seated history and its very kind of specific type of culture, but a culture that is partly Greek, partly Egyptian, and then brings in other elements as well, Britain nonetheless looms large. And Britain loomed large because in many ways it was seen as the ultimate kind of frontier, the absolute mystical place just beyond the known world. And again, we might kind of have a few important questions about the reality and actually what we have here and how much we can know about early Britain. But certainly for the Romans, it was presented as an area that was kind of within this world, but also close to the next. And there was this kind of focus on it as the ultimate frontier. And we know a lot about it. We can see it in all different writings. At least 100 ancient writers talk about it, and we have all different names that are useful, but of course only kind of tell us so much about either the Greek or the Roman ideas. Britain was known, and it was known for a long time, and it existed in the Roman worldview, but mostly as a place to influence, if not conquer. We do know about those peoples who come before. We normally call them the Celtic peoples, but that's kind of a catch-all term. Archaeologists tend to prefer late pre-Roman Iron Age, which I think is a touch more specific. But what we can see in this world quite clearly is in no sense unity, in no sense a kind of political structure that is opposed as one people towards Rome. And in reality, this is a highly stratified world, different to Rome, but where you have different power groups, different peoples. And we can translate the Latin a number of different ways, but I tend to prefer either nations or peoples. You know, it gives us a better image of what this world is. And it falls under various stages of Roman rule. When we look at Calgacus, then, what we're really seeing is the kind of final effort to solidify Roman power here. So there's a reason that Rome has arrived, and it's to do with the emergence of imperial power. It's to do with Claudius and his ambitions, and also perhaps his political weaknesses in the city of Rome. By the time we get to this, however, we've moved beyond the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And what I wanted to end with, which I appreciate is deeply forlorn and very, very pessimistic, is the barbarian idea of freedom falling against the Roman army. Because what we have, even if we have this wonderfully eloquent, highly accomplished, incredibly courageous barbarian leader in Calgacus, is a Roman army that is able to defeat anyone so long as they can control their engagement and so long as they're led by a figure that would exist in the early annals of Roman history. And that's what they have in Agricola, this great, powerful Roman general. So what we have as a consequence of this is a massed battle, a battle against a huge number of barbarian forces, against a small, focused professional force of Roman legionaries. And Rome is victorious. There's no moment in this battle really where the barbarians are likely to succeed in spite of their numbers, but that's not where Tacitus stops. And instead what he gives us is the post-battle euphoria for Rome, hysteria for those that they've conquered. And the reason I like this so much is because it exposes the reality away from how Rome views themselves. Yes, they create this empire. Yes, they believe themselves chosen by the gods. But behind all of this are a people, a nation, a population, a society that is crushed, swallowed, and reformed. And that's what Tacitus tells us, that the cost of empire is not just the freedom of these individuals, it's their freedom to be who they are, to speak the language they want, to dress as they wish to, and to believe in their own gods. And we get this really powerful image of a people that had broken, fractured, never to be restored, never to fall in again. And some of the more famous lines: an awful silence has settled everywhere, the hills were deserted, houses were smoking in the distance, and our scouts, the Roman scouts, meet no one. Why? Because the barbarian figures themselves have either taken their own lives, and again, an echo of something Tara was looking at earlier, or they've taken the lives of their loved ones to stop them being enslaved by Rome. So what we have from a Roman writer is this image of Calgacus, who may exist or may very well not, but an image of a noble barbarian who dies. And he dies fighting against a Roman army led by a virtuous Roman, but under the rulership, by this stage, of a deeply vice-ridden, tyrannical emperor. And that becomes a continuous theme when you look at the rise of the emperor. So I wanted to end, sadly everyone, with a forlorn note where Rome is victorious, but it's only victorious by crushing, by destroying, and by stripping away another people, another nation, another culture. And with that, Gronya, as fast as I can, I'm happy to open the floor up again to any questions for myself, Tara, or Gronya. We're all happy to help.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, and amazing that you managed to wrap that up in all of about 7 minutes. So very impressive. Do we have any questions? If you do, please put them in the chat. We have had one come in that I'll start us off with. And that was from a teacher that emailed in earlier. I'm now trying to find my email. And it was asking about the links between, or I suppose, the links between some of the GCSE modules. And actually, we've touched on quite a lot of the GCSE modules in this session. We've thought about Foundations of Rome, we've thought about Cleopatra, Hannibal, and Roman Britain. And the teacher has asked whether there are perhaps some modules on both the Greek and the Roman side of the GCSE that complement one another in the teaching of these different modules. Tara, what are your thoughts? I
can tell you what we do, and I think that's probably the best way to start with this. We do Persia and Alexander the Great, because you can see the natural progression there. You talk up the Persian Empire and then you destroy it. It's great. So that kind of makes chronological sense. It also allows for the thread of Egypt to carry through, because we also do then Foundations and then Cleopatra. Well, I seem to spend half my time talking about Egypt. It's great. So the Persians conquer it, Alexander conquers it, Cleopatra rules it. And that's lovely, and that's really good, because actually most of the time we're talking about the Middle East, and it really appeals to my students. Foundations connects up with Cleopatra. I mean, it might work better with Hannibal. It depends on whether how seriously you sort of take the early Republican stuff as being historical. But you talk about the running of the Republic during the Hannibal module. We sort of make reference to it in Cleopatra, but not in any great detail. Roman Britain, I'm not sure how you connect to that from the others, but I've never taught it. So yeah, I mean, I can sort of talk about it from our perspective, and we haven't taught the other Greek units. I simply looked at the number of sources for those and decided that Alexander was more straightforward and fitted better with Persia. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I think that's quite a common combination. Persia, Alexander, Foundations, and Cleopatra, but it's what you like. It's whatever you want to teach.
Yeah, and certainly Alexander and Cleopatra are the two runaway most popular modules, and I think Hannibal isn't far behind that. But I think as teachers of history, we're all, once you've taught something through once, you start to see where those links come through in the modules that you're choosing, and you're able to sort of overlap your teaching in that way.